The individual letter fa has striking resemblance to the letter ba. Start off with a small stroke going downwards. And then, in one continuous stroke, you would first go left, then upwards, and then come down diagonally towards the right, and stop about a nuqta or nuqta and a half above the baseline. The tail end of the letter fa is exactly the same as the tail end of the letter ba. And there are the measurements for the letter fa. When the letter fa appears in the beginning of a module, the initial shape is exactly the same as the initial part of the individual letter. And the last stroke is just like the second stroke of the commencing letter ba. And that's how you would continue on afterwards. The middle letter fa has a different shape than the individual and the commencing letter. So you'd go left, go up into a loop, and then your next stroke would be vertical, and then you would go on and continue to the next letter. And this shape here is 2 by 2 nuqtas. The finishing letter fa is a combination of the middle module and the tail end of the letter ba. So you come down, and then you would script the tail end of the letter ba here. And there we are. The letter qaf is very similar to the letter fa, except that the initial shape starts off a little bit lower, right by the baseline, and that the tail end is not like the tail end of the letter ba, but instead like the tail end of the letter sin. So this is the initial shape here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and script the tail end of the letter sin here. There we are. Just going to go ahead and put in the nuqtas. Now for commencing letter and middle letter qaf, please revisit the lesson on Fa, as those letters are exactly the same. The finishing letter Qaf is very similar to the individual letter, except that the initial flick downwards does not exist, and you just continue the loop from the previous letter. And there you have letter Qaf. The first stroke of the individual letter Kaf is just like the Alif, with the only difference being that this letter stops about half a nuqta above the top baseline. The second stroke is a fairly horizontal stroke, which ends, frankly speaking, quite abruptly. It is a very unconventional way of ending a stroke, and ends in a very oblique manner, just like that. I'm going to go ahead and put a little hat on top of the alif here. Now take note that the shape here is actually not the Hamza. It is actually a very unique shape that looks kind of like the Hamza in the Diwani script, but definitely not the Hamza in Nask. So here are the measurements for the letter Kaf. When Kaf appears in the beginning of a module, it starts off with a slightly curved diagonal stroke, which stops about 1 nuqta above the baseline. Just like that. The second stroke is essentially an exaggerated version of the middle letter Ba. So as you can see, this is a symmetric shape, except that it is a little longer than the middle letter Ba. I'm just going to go ahead and fix the width on the stroke. Now the next part is a diagonal stroke that is about 6 nuqtas wide and about 3 or 4 nuqtas high, just like that. Now notice that this is a linear stroke. You can also go ahead and add a small curved stroke where these two strokes meet, just like that. Alternatively, you can also script the Kaf like this. So a slightly curved stroke that comes downwards and ends in a flick. Now, depending on your dominant hand, you are going to script a horizontal connected to the stroke that we just scripted. Now, as I mentioned before, because I'm left-handed, I am a lot more comfortable scripting longer horizontal strokes from right to left. But if you're right-handed, you can by all means script this from left to right. And that's where it connects with the initial stroke. The last stroke is actually slanted just ever so slightly downwards. So believe it or not, this is not exactly parallel to the stroke right above it. It may seem so to the naked eye, however, that is not the case. And as this is a longer stroke, you can see that I had to refill the ink in my pen a couple of times. And there's the letter. And the measurements here are very flexible. You don't have to go with the actual number of nuqtas, especially for the longer loop part. So here's another alternative to your commencing letter kaf. Now if you add a small flick here, right in the beginning, this actually becomes into the middle letter kaf. The first commencing letter that we discussed could also be made into a middle letter kaf if it is connected from the initial stroke. The only difference would be that that bulge or that small curved stroke that we scripted would not be there. The finishing letter kaf starts off with a shape that looks like the finishing letter alif, and the second stroke starts off a little bit higher on the stem, comes down, and then you would script a curved stroke that meets the baseline and then curves back upwards. This is very similar to the last stroke of the letter ba. Just like that. And I'm just going to go ahead and add the Diwani Hamza here. And there we are. Letter kaf. The individual letter lam is a combination of the letter alif and the tail end of the letter sin. So here's the alif, and I'm just going to go ahead and script the tail end of the letter seen here. And then you can go ahead and add a little hat on top. And there we have the individual letter lam. When lam comes in the beginning of a module, it is basically the letter alif followed by the middle letter ba. So nothing complex here at all. Add a little hat on top, and here we have the basic commencing letter lam. When lam appears before the letter alif, or better known as a letter, lam alif, it starts off with a pretty elaborate diagonal stroke that starts off about 6 or 7 nuqtas above the baseline and ends right at the baseline. The height of this shape is the same as the height of the standard alif. Now, as you can see, I'm going to do a great job of scripting this. So I'm just going to make sure I fill in all the empty spaces around the stroke. The second stroke is a very short horizontal stroke that starts from the bottom of the first stroke and ends about 2 nuqtas on the left hand side. The last stroke starts vertically aligned from the rightmost spot of the second stroke, goes down, and right before it reaches the initial stroke, it cuts in diagonally and meets the end of the second stroke, just like that. And you can go ahead and add a little hat on top of that stroke. And here you have the measurements for that. Also add a little curved stroke on the initial stroke here. And there you have one version of lam alif. The second version of lam alif starts off with a vertical stroke that starts off about 6 or 7 nuqtas above the baseline. And about halfway through, you would cut in and script a curved stroke that ends with a flick. Now starting a little left to the end point and a little bit lower than the top of the initial stroke, you would script in a pretty elaborate diagonal stroke here that meets the initial stroke. I'm just going to make sure I fill in all the empty spaces here. when lam appears before a dal, another lam, kaf, or letter ha, then you can extend the letter all the way and surpass the top baseline, and then come back upwards. So in this case, the letter lam would be a little longer than usual. In this case, I'll script in the letter dal to show you the entire module. And you can add a little hat on top of the lam. When lam appears before a jim, mim, or ya, then the lam could be quite short. Ending with a diagonal or even a horizontal stroke, depending on the letter that follows. So in this case, I'll go with the letter G. And as you can see, the lam is practically half the length of its conventional height. Once again, you can go ahead and add a little hat on top of that. When lam appears before a jim, this is also another method that you can use to write the letter lam. So you'd go up and then you'd come down sharply, and then you would begin to level out. This is almost a very skewed version of the letter ba, which appears before the letter jim. So this is what the lam would look like when it appears before a jim. When lam appears in the middle of a module, the initial part of it looks like the finishing letter alif. Followed by the middle letter ba. So as you can see, this is very similar to the initial commencing letter that we discussed. Now, when lam comes in the middle of a module and is followed by an alif, then essentially the shape that we discussed earlier could be made into a middle letter, just like that. When lam appears at the end of a module, it looks very similar to the individual letter, except that the initial stroke would be like the finishing stroke of alif. Just a small stem coming down. it's just a matter of scripting the last part of the letter seen. And here we have it, the letter Lam. The letter Mim could be a little challenging for beginners. And so the first letter that I'm going to draw here is the individual letter Mim. That is actually not quite correct, but is something that a lot of beginners tend to create. And so I would like to show you the difference between what most people would begin creating and what the meme should really look like. So this is the conventional meme that a lot of my beginner students would create. So everything is great except for the gap that is in the middle of the initial loop. So as you create the meme, and this is the correct version, make sure that the initial stroke is elaborate. It's large enough so that when you create that second stroke, the gap in the middle is a little bit more noticeable. Just like that. And then the last stroke would actually be very similar to the stroke we scripted in the incorrect version. And those are the measurements for the letter Meme. So again, this is the correct version, and this is the incorrect version here. Here's an alternative method to writing the individual letter Meme. It starts off with a stroke that starts about 1 nuqta above the baseline. Go up, and then come down diagonally towards the right, and then would meet the baseline. The second stroke essentially connects these 2 points of the initial stroke. The third stroke is a very small stroke that starts from the right of the origin of the shape. And then the last stroke is essentially a very elaborate flick, just like that. I'm going to go ahead and fill up any empty spaces here. When meme appears in the beginning of a module, it actually looks very similar to the initial part of the last letter we discussed. So you'd go up, come down and meet the baseline. The second stroke would connect the 2 points and would just surpass it a little bit to the left. And then you would go ahead and continue on to the next letter from here on onwards. When meme appears before a ya, another meme, or a jim, it could essentially take a shape like this, which is a closed loop and is comprised of 3 strokes. And there are the measurements of this meme. When meme appears in the middle of a module, this is how it's scripted. So you go up and come down, but not all the way till the baseline. The second stroke essentially is a straight and diagonal stroke that would go and meet the ending point of the previous stroke, and then would just continue onwards to the next letter. The width of this meme is just 1 nuqta. Alternatively, the meme could also be written in this manner. So just a little bulge on the right hand side corner of the letter. When meme appears at the end of a module, it looks very similar to the individual letter, except that it is connected from the top. If you're choosing this method to end your module, this is a letter that can only be connected from the top. And as you can see, this is almost identical to the individual letter we learned. Now, if you'd like a finishing meme to be connected from the right hand side as opposed to the top, then you can script it this way. So it starts off with a very small and curved diagonal stroke, just like this. You would then script another diagonal stroke that essentially makes this into a closed loop. The next step is to script a fairly horizontal, slightly slanted downward stroke that goes ahead from the top of the initial loop and meets the baseline. And the last stroke is essentially identical to the final stroke of the individual letter. The individual letter Nun is a combination of the first stroke of Ra and the tail end of Sin. So here is the first stroke of Ra, and here's the tail end of C. Now notice that one side is longer than the other, and that's fine. That's how Nun is written in calligraphy. And notice that the dot of the Nun is above the body of the Nun and not inside. When Nun comes at the end of a module, it looks just like the individual letter, except that it is connected on the right hand side. The individual letter Ha is probably one of the easier letters we're going to learn in Nask. It starts off with a diagonal stroke going down towards the right, and it starts to curve in right at the end. The second stroke is a curve that starts from where we left off, goes around, overlaps the origin, and stops right above there. And the whole width of the letter is about 2.5 noqtas. The commencing letter Ha starts off with a diagonal stroke. It starts about 3 noqtas above the baseline. It is slightly curved and it's going down towards the right. And as it curves down, it'll touch the baseline. And now we are basically scripting the middle letter Fa. So you'd go up, make that curve, go down. And then basically pull out. And there you have the dimensions for the commencing letter Ha. When Ha comes in the middle of the module, it starts off with a loop that is quite small in height. So the first stroke ends right underneath, about 1 nuqta under the top baseline. And then as you pull up, as soon as you surpass the initial line, you'll dip to the right, just ever so slightly. And then a downward stroke like this. And the last stroke here will extend to the next letter. And here are the dimensions for the middle letter Ha. The beginning of the finishing letter Ha is somewhat like the letter Dal. So you'd go up vertically, slanted slightly towards the left, and then you will script a small loop on the left hand side of the stem. The letter Waw is essentially a combination of the initial shape of the letter Fa and the tail end of the letter Ra. So here is the initial shape of Fa, and I'm just going to go ahead and script the tail end of Ra. And there we have the letter Waw. When Waw appears at the end of a module, it is essentially a combination of the first part of the finishing letter Qaf, and the second part is, again, the tail end of Ra. And here we are, the finishing letter Waw. The individual letter Ya is made up of 3 strokes. For the first stroke, you would go up slightly and then come down sharply and stop about half a nuqta above the top baseline. The second stroke is a fairly horizontal stroke that will stretch all the way till underneath the vertical point where the initial stroke started from. The third stroke is essentially the tail end of Sin, except that it is a bit longer than that in width. So the width of the tail end of Ya would be about 6 nuqtas. And here we have the measurements for the letter Ya. The finishing letter Ya is essentially identical to the individual letter, except that it would be connected on the initial stroke on the right hand side. When Ya appears at the end of a module, there is an alternative method where you can script only the last 2 strokes of Ya in this manner. So typically, you can use this version when the Ya comes after a Lam or a Ba, Nun or Ya, for example. And there we have the letter Ya. The letter Hamza is made up of 2 strokes. For the first stroke, you would sort of start off the same way as you did for Ya, and then turn inwards into a horizontal stroke. And then the second stroke is a simple diagonal stroke that is stretched all the way till the vertical point of the leftmost spot of the initial stroke. And here we are, letter Hamza. For this last module of Naskh, we're going to use a few of the building blocks we have learned until now and write a sample sentence together. For the Naskh script, we're going to write Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Now, for this script exclusively, I'm showing you the demonstration from a side view, just so you can have a different view at what the pen looks like when it hits the paper. So here is the individual letter Alif for Allahumma. Just going to go ahead and fill up any gaps I've left behind. And I'm just going to go ahead and add a little hat on top of the Alif. The commencing letter Lam for Allahumma would have the same height and shape as the individual letter Alif. fill up any empty gaps here. Just like the alif, we can add a little hat on top. Just like that. Now the middle letter lam would also have the same shape and height as the individual letter alif and the lam that came before it. The only difference here would be that the middle letter lam would not have a hat on top of it. Now I'll go ahead and script the middle letter ha. Go up, I would tilt in the script a little bit. Come down. And then continue the stroke over to the next letter. Finishing letter meme that we'll be using here is a combination of the middle letter meme and the individual letter meme that has a flick at the end. So here is a shape for the middle letter meme. And then a little stroke would go underneath, followed by a flick. And I'll go ahead and fill up the empty gap here. The next letter is Sad. Solly. So again, the initial stroke of Sad could be scripted from right to left or left to right. And if you're right-handed, then most likely you would be more comfortable with scripting this from left to right. Now right after the bevel, I would curve upwards to script the stem of the finishing letter lam. So the length and the shape of the stroke would be very similar to the alif and the two lams we have already scripted. Script the tail end of the C, which appears at the end of lam. Just like that. The next letter would be the commencing letter Ain. So here is the first stroke for Ain. And once again, right after the bevel, I would curve upwards to script the middle letter, Lam. And we can go ahead and sketch the top part of Ain. Now, for the finishing letter, Ya, we would be using the alternative method here. So, we would only be scripting the last two strokes of the letter Ya. Now, this is the version that can appear after the letters Lam, Ba, Noon, or Ya. There we have the word Ala. The last word here is Muhammad. And for the commencing letter Mim, we would be using that 3-stroke triangular version that appears before a Jim. Just like that. And I would go ahead and script a Ha right underneath that. Now the middle letter Mim after Ha is going to be scripted a different way than what we have learned, and so I will script that right after I script the stem for the letter Dal. So when Mim appears in the middle of a module and after Jim, you can create the Mim just by using 2 strokes on the lower body of the letter, just like that. And I'm going to go ahead and script the last stroke of finishing letter Dal. And there we have the body of the sentence, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Now using a Java read column, I'm going to go ahead and put in all the tashkeel. So there will be a fatha on top of the alif. There would be a shadda on top of the second lam. And there will be a fatha on top of that shadda. Now, keep note that this fatha should be centered on top of the shadda. Now I'll script a dhamma on top of the ha. then there would be another shadda with a fatha on top above the meme. And there we are. We'll also go ahead and script a fatha on top of the sad. Now on top of the lam, there would be a shadda with a kathra underneath it. And there we are. Now there will be a fatha on top of the ayn. Followed by a small madda on top of the ya. Also there will be a fatha on top of the lam. Script the dhamma on top of the meme in Muhammad. There we are. Also, there will be a fatha on top of the ha. And there will be a shadda with a fatha on top of it above the middle letter meme in Muhammad. And there we have it, the sentence Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And this is what the final artwork looked like.